adults. We are continuing our series titled Good News People. This week, Chad Golden is talking to us about relationships. Camille started last week. If you haven't watched it, go check out our Relationships Part 1 video. And Chad's going to talk to us this week about relationships again. We're in this series called Good News People, where we're talking about how the gospel intersects with our lives. If you haven't joined us yet on a Thursday, we invite you to come. We've been meeting every single Thursday, either online or in person at IBC in the parking lot, and you are invited. All young adults are invited, so invite a friend, join us on Thursday, and meet us in the parking lot or on Zoom. Information is going to be attached to this video. If you want to sign up, we'd love to have you. You have a great week.
Hey IBC Young Adults, thank you for tuning in for our next part of our Good News People series. Today is part 2 of relationships and how the gospel impacts our relationships and the way that we relate to one another. So I've been given the task today to explore the gospel implications in our relationships. And so in order to do that, I'm going to start by telling you probably the most interesting story that I have. My wife Renee and I have been married for about 3.5 years, and very early on in our marriage, we found ourselves in a situation that we never anticipated being in. We were sitting in a little room being interviewed by the FBI for a murder investigation. I didn't do it, don't worry. What had happened was we were in our room and we went out onto the balcony to get a little bit of fresh air as we were on this Alaskan cruise. And we had looked over our balcony and had seen the aftermath of a guy who had murdered his wife and was attempting to dispose of the body overboard and was also trying to himself jump overboard to get out of the situation. And so fortunately the security guards had gotten there and they had pulled him down and arrested him, and eventually the boat pulled over to shore, and we were boarded by the Coast Guard and the FBI, and he was arrested and eventually pled guilty and is in jail now. But anybody who was a witness to any of that had to give a formal statement to the FBI, and so we were witnesses, and so we gave our account of what we had seen. And as soon as we got cell phone service, we called our families. Especially important to me was calling Renee's family, my in-laws, because if her dad specifically had seen a news headline that said man murders wife on Alaskan cruise, without any other context, I feel like I would have been in a lot of trouble. So we made sure to clarify that right away. But the reason I bring this story up is because I think a lot of us can look back in our lives and see some failed relationships that we've had. Maybe it was a friendship that we had a falling out. Maybe it was a dating relationship that you put a lot of stock in that didn't end up working out the way you anticipated. Maybe it was even a marriage that ultimately ended in divorce. Relationships are really important to what it means to be human. We're created to be in relationships with God and with one another. And so today I want to look at, what does a successful relationship look like? What does the culture say a successful relationship is? And what does Jesus say a successful relationship looks like? And so we're going to look at that in 2 different lenses, through looking at successful relationships in marriage and in singleness. And so the text today that we're going to be rooted in is John chapter 15, verses 5, and then verses 12 and 13. And so as a little bit of context before I jump in, this is during the final days of Jesus' life. He is sitting in a room with his disciples and basically letting them know that he's about to leave. He knew he was about to be crucified, and so he's giving them some instruction and some advice for how to move forward. In a lot of ways, it looks like he's giving them the marching orders for how to proceed when he is gone. And so let's look at this passage together. If you have a Bible, you can turn to John chapter 15. It says, verse 5 says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him bears much fruit." And then skipping to verse 12, he says, "My commandment is this, to love one another just as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, that one lays down his life for his friends." So I want to specifically, like I said, look at this and how this passage may impact our lives, and like I said, through the 2 specific lenses of marriage and singleness. And so in order to do that, it requires asking the question, what does it look like to love like Jesus? And I think we see over and over again in the gospel accounts Jesus loving in a self-sacrificial way, in a way that elevated the value, dignity, and worth of those that he came in contact with. It was a life of self-sacrifice that Jesus put on display for us. And I think Camille did an awesome job last week of explaining that, of what it looks like to be in relationship. And so I don't want to rehash a lot of that, but I think it bears mentioning that Jesus' command to his disciples in John 15, and by extension to us today, is to use his life as a model for how we are to interact with other people, to abide in him, to rely on his strength, and live in a self-giving, self-sacrificial way. So, in the specific context of marriage, we see this command of Jesus repeated almost identically in Ephesians chapter 5. Paul is talking about the relationships between husbands and wives. And so we don't have a ton of time to really dive in deep to this passage, but there's a couple things that I wanted to point out. First, beginning in verse 21, he talks about husbands and wives submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he tells wives to submit to their husbands, and husbands to love their wives as Christ has loved the church. So a couple observations. First is that verse 21 talks about mutual submission, about husbands and wives submitting to one another, because that is what Christ has called them to do, to set aside their own interests, their own desires for the betterment of the other person. I think this also involves deferring to one another's strengths, to saying, hey, you're better at doing this, I'm going to follow you and let you lead in this area. And so one just funny example, in my marriage, I am terrible with numbers in life, not just in marriage, but as it relates to my marriage, that means that Renee does a lot of our budgeting and a lot of our finances, because if I was in charge of that, our finances would be a mess. And so that's an area that she's really strong in, and so I defer to her, and that's a place in where I submit to her in that regard. Paul shifts next to the relationship of wives submitting to their husbands, and this is a super controversial verse that has been used and abused throughout the centuries, but I think it's important to bring up, even though some of you may have like a little bit of tension in your stomach, or your eyes may have gotten wide when you heard that I was going to talk about this. But the reason that I think it's important to bring up is because the more that I have studied this passage, the more I've realized that I think this has less to do with authority than we think, and much more to do with loyalty. And the reason for that, there's a lot of reasons I've come to that conclusion, but two of which I wanted to point out. First is that the verse before, verse 21, Paul says that husbands are to submit to their wives as well. There is a mutual submission. That is the foundation that these exhortations are made on. The second is a contextual one. This letter was written in the Roman world, and in that context, there was a person known as the pater familias, and he essentially the patriarch of the family. And so that person had absolute control over everybody in his family. And so even if a woman went and got married and had a husband, her father could still tell her that she needed to divorce her husband and marry someone else. Because a lot of marriages in those days were done for political reasons, or for power or benefit of the family, not for love like we would normally think today. And so I think that Paul is really saying here that women, when they get married, need to be loyal to their husband, that there's no other person that gets to say, you need to divorce your husband. There's no other person that can break up that relationship, because of how sacred that is and what it reflects and what it means to God. And so then Paul shifts to husbands loving their wives in the way that Christ has loved the church. Quite bluntly, Paul says husbands need to be willing to die for their wives. And like I just mentioned, in a culture where women were not given the same value, dignity, and respect that we see in America today, that would have been a shocking statement. I cannot overstate how unheard of this would have been. There are lots of instances we see that husbands didn't even like their wives, much less love them. So this is completely out of the blue that Paul is saying you need to be willing to die for your wife. He's saying there is something so special and unique about this marriage relationship because it reflects the love that Christ has for the church, the love that Jesus has for us. It adds a lot of context to the whole what God has joined together, let no man separate. This marriage is important because of what it points to. So then moving on to singleness and how Jesus' command in John 15 impacts that, I wanted to just address an opening concern that marriage is not the pinnacle of Christian existence. I feel like we get that sense a lot of like you reach a higher plane of existence when you get married, and that is just not true. In fact, a lot of examples that we have in the Bible of really powerful people doing great things are single people. I mean, Jesus being first and foremost, but he's God, so you might think that that doesn't count. But Paul, too, who gave us most of our New Testament, was single and actually says how, in a lot of ways, it's better to stay single because you have more freedom to serve the kingdom and serve others. So I just wanted to start out by saying that, and then also just make the observation that the Bible has very little to say about finding the right person or finding the one, but it has a lot to say about being the right person. And so I think a lot of us have bought into this like Disney theology of relationships where we think, and we might not say it explicitly like this, but we think that if we just find that right person, if we find the one, all of our problems are going to go away. And that is just simply not true. I think anybody who's married can tell you that you bring in your own problems and add another person into the mix, and it can be a mess. So I hate to burst your bubble if that's something that you were thinking. And there's this quote by Andy Stanley that I really like. He says, are you the person that you're looking for is looking for? Are you the person that you're looking for is looking for? I like this a lot because I think it shifts the focus off of, like I said, finding the right person to becoming the right person. It shifts the focus from being a passive, just waiting around for that person to come along to an active time of formation. He's saying that whatever season of life you find yourself in, if that's a time of singleness, whether it's for a short time or for a lifetime, to view that time as a formative experience of a time where you can abide in Jesus and grow closer to him and to others. So that's the question that we have to ask ourselves of, are we abiding in Jesus by growing in relationship with him and with our communities? So that begs the question, how do I become the right person? Fortunately, we aren't left without a guide. Paul, again, in 1 Corinthians 13, kind of extrapolates what Jesus meant in John 15 and says what it means to love like him. And chances are, if you've been to a wedding in the last 50 years, you've probably heard this passage read. And fun fact, it's not a wedding text. Paul didn't sit down and write this in order to make a pastor's job easier when they're sitting writing a wedding sermon. This is a explanation of what it looks like to love others for anyone, no matter what stage of life they're in. So if you have a Bible, turn there. I'm going to read just some of these descriptors that we find in 1 Corinthians 13. It says, love is patient, kind, not envious, doesn't brag, it's not puffed up, rude, or self-serving, not easily angered or resentful. It's not glad about injustice, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. And Paul goes on to say that even if you can prophesy, even if you're the most intelligent person ever, if you don't love, if you don't know how to love well, it's all meaningless. It's all pointless. And far too often, I think that we love to the best of our willingness instead of loving to the best of our ability. And I think Scripture actually calls us to love beyond our ability. I think that's part of what it means to abide in Jesus and rely on his strengths when we have those people that are really difficult to love. And so when trying to figure out how to love like Jesus, I think we can ask ourselves some of these diagnostic questions using 1 Corinthians 13 as a kind of framework. Am I being patient? Am I being kind? Am I doing things in this friendship, in this marriage, out of self-interest or out of the interest of the other person? There's an old saying that goes, what does love require of me? And I think that can be a really helpful question to ask when we are in relationships with other people and when we compare it with the framework that we find in 1 Corinthians 13. What does love in this relationship require of me? It requires patience, kindness, and the rest of the attributes that we find. And so Jesus calls us to abide in him and to demonstrate his love to those around us, to anyone that we are in relationship with. So this, again, as I said, involves viewing whatever season we're in as a formative experience, as an opportunity to grow in love, to become the right person, whether that's the right person for a potential spouse, whether that's the right person for your current spouse, or whether that's the right person because it's who Jesus has called you to be. And so it involves asking ourselves these diagnostic questions as we go about our day, as a kind of check-in to see if we're loving others well. And so that's my challenge to you this week, is to begin asking yourself these types of questions in the context of the relationships that you find yourself in. Begin asking yourself, what does love require of me? And then my challenge is to do something tangible to love someone else in your life well. Not because it's going to bring some sort of good back on you, but because you want to demonstrate the love that you have for them that's rooted in the love that Jesus has for you. And so may we go out this week as a clearer picture of Jesus' love for us, and let us put that love on display through our relationships.